Hi, I'm Amy Toby. I'm Senior Principal Engineer for Digital Interconnection at Equinix. And today I have with me
Lukas Gentele.
Tell me a little bit about yourself.
I'm the CEO of Loft Labs. We're the company that got vCluster started, technology and open source project for creating virtual Kubernetes clusters.
Virtual Kubernetes Clusters. Now, aren't a bunch of people already running Kubernetes on VMs?
Right.
So are you running Kubernetes on VMs, or are you running something else on top of Kubernetes?
Yeah, there's like, VMs, containers, Kubernetes, and now there's virtual Kubernetes on top. We get the question a lot in terms of like, do we need another layer, another abstraction, right? Who's going to manage that? What do we need to learn to adopt it? I think the same questions that Docker got in the early days probably
Right, yeah.
Containers, right? Is it safe? Should we use this? Is this the right choice? The next thing, right? And I'm pretty sure VMware had the same questions.
I remember they did.
20 years ago
Yep.
or so, right? And I think we are at the point where people now understand why it makes sense to have virtual clusters. You know, we got the project started 2.5 years ago, and after 12 months, we hit 1 million virtual clusters. And we're like, wow, this is amazing. That's a big number, right? But now 1.5 years later, we just hit 40 million virtual clusters created. So you can see there's definitely a shift in terms of like people understand now why it makes sense. And I feel like there's a lot of trust in that this is an abstraction layer that is needed and one that you can rely on.
Okay, so it's an abstraction layer on top of Kubernetes that lets you kind of almost do Kubernetes inside Kubernetes.
Pretty much, yeah. You can even have virtual clusters and virtual clusters if you want it.
Oh, lovely. How deep can it go, though? How many turtles can we stack?
Yeah, we actually have a video. It's called vCluster Inception.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, like the movie, right? You go deeper into dreams, you go deeper in Kubernetes. We haven't tested the limit yet, but because of the asynchronous
Well, there's your
nature-
next demo.
What was that?
There's your next demo.
Yeah.
How many turtles can we stack?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we tried a couple, like 3 or 4 layers at this point. It doesn't make sense at a certain point, but I think you can actually go pretty deep. I mean, due to the asynchronous reconciliation loop in Kubernetes, you can go pretty deep. Just like it takes a little bit longer to reconcile even further. Like every loop adds another 100 milliseconds, right? So at a certain point in time, you got to wait a little bit longer for that pod to be scheduled.
Yeah. So one of the things I like to ask, though, is like we've talked about some technology here, but what problems are your customers solving with it?
It's mainly multi-tenancy and reducing Kubernetes cost, right?
Okay.
We've seen companies that spin up 500 or even 1,000 plus Kubernetes clusters.
That's a lot of
for their engineers and pre-production, for CI workloads, right? And that's a lot of clusters to manage. All of these clusters have a lot of redundancy, right? They have like Open Policy Agent, Istio, right? All of these compliance, logging, monitoring tools, right? And a lot of the time, if you take a cluster, especially in pre-production, that runs idle on a Saturday, it runs idle at night, right? Nobody's really using that Istio, right? It's not doing much overnight. So multi-tenancy would actually be really great for Kubernetes. Kubernetes is designed as a very scalable system, right? I remember in the early days of Kubernetes, it was all about how many pods can we put in the Kubernetes cluster,
Yeah, I
right?
remember that too, yeah.
Yeah, it was always like, oh, we hit the 10,000.
How many nodes can we get to?
How many nodes, exactly. And then I feel like with a lot of the public clouds today, it's essentially everybody starts creating these little clusters because it's easy. You can spin it up in a public cloud with a couple of clicks,
Like
right?
2-3 nodes.
Yeah, but Kubernetes is actually really good at running a large cluster, right? The problem is, though, multi-tenancy is really hard in Kubernetes because the only construct you have in Kubernetes to isolate something is a namespace.
Right.
But a namespace is not really any isolation. It's really just like, I always tell people it's kind of it's a space for names, right?
Yeah.
It's like you can now create 2 things that are called database and they're not conflicting, but that's as much as isolation as you have, right?
It doesn't isolate the resources.
Exactly. The resources,
it has
the
some
network,
control
the
over resources, but they're not isolated within the cluster.
Correct, yeah.
And so your product creates a level of isolation. So how does that work? Is it's sitting inside of a namespace,
Correct.
and it's isolating it through what mechanisms?
Yeah, so essentially what we do is we launch a Kubernetes control plane inside a container.
Okay.
So you have a pod running that runs the vCluster control plane, which is a certified Kubernetes distro. That means talking to a real cluster or virtual one should pretty much be the same, right? We pass all the conformance tests that the CNCF has for certified clusters. Every time we launch a new vCluster version in the open source, we run through all the compliance tests again to verify that. And essentially, what you get is a Kubernetes API server that you can expose via Kubernetes service, via ingress, via load balancer, right? And then you talk to that virtual clusters API server, to that containerized API server, rather than the real underlying clusters API server. And it has a separate data store as well. So if I create a CRD, or a stateful set or deployment, one namespace, it lives entirely just in that virtual clusters data store, and you won't see it in the underlying cluster. But your controller manager, and the virtual cluster has a controller manager as well, sees like, okay, this deployment has replica number 2, so I got to create 2 pods. Pods is just an entry in your data store again.
Right. Yep.
And then the question comes up, okay, but how do the pods actually get started, right? How do we study, which nodes do they end up, right?
Right.
And that's the kind of magic of vCluster. What vCluster does is synchronizes these pods down to the host cluster.
Okay.
So in the host cluster, you see all the pods, and the host cluster runs your actual containers. So you don't have to trust us to do that well, right?
Right.
You can trust your existing cloud provider, your bare metal deployment.
And your observability works normally and all of that stuff.
Exactly. Things like Datadog, things like an OPA that prevents you from launching privileged pods, right? All of that still works, right? Istio, networking, right? Network policies in your namespace, all of that still takes effect, right? But all of the higher level Kubernetes constructs, right? All of these CRDs, deployments, etc.,
They just work.
they're virtualized, right?
Yeah.
It means I can be admin inside my vCluster, but in an underlying cluster, I only have the privilege to create pods. And
Sounds like
that's
it'd be really nice for Kube developers especially.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of people, and we use it ourselves, right? We're obviously building vCluster with vCluster,
Yeah.
right? And
Well, it's important to drink your own champagne.
we've seen a lot of people like build, controllers that essentially really got excited about vCluster. We've also seen folks when they want to try, you want to install a Helm chart, right? You're looking at Artifact Hub, right? And you're seeing a Helm chart, you want to try it like Argo CD, right? Has a whole bunch of CRDs, right? Or a Helm chart that just enforces a network policy or RBAC, right? And you may not be able to install that today if you just have a namespace and a cluster and very limited permissions. So you got to go to your admin, you got to go to your platform team. Do they want to maintain this, right?
No, nobody does.
They may push back on like you installing this. With a vCluster, that's easy. And we see a lot of the times actually engineers, if they have the permission to create a pod today, they can create a vCluster, right?
Interesting.
They can elevate.
So you can kind of slip on in there before anybody even knows your product's on the site.
Yeah. We see that actually happening when people don't necessarily, obviously some companies are very air-gapped and they have they push back on all the images and have to import in the private registries. But some allow images from Docker Hub and GitHub, and then you can do this, right? And then we sometimes get we get to a customer conversation. They're interested in vCluster on a more strategic level, and then we find out, oh, you already have a couple hundred running of these things, right?
So you said it's the core of it is open source.
Correct.
And then you also sell it as a product. So what's the difference between your open source product and your commercial product?
Yeah, so vCluster is an open source project. It's Apache 2 licensed. You find it on GitHub. So if you're creating virtual clusters, the core technology, everything's open source. We support multiple Kubernetes distros, all in the open source. So the control plane can be K3S based, K0S based. It can run obviously with vanilla Kubernetes with etcd. It can also run EKS. The EKS team actually contributed this, which was really exciting to see. I think they saw these other distros and they're like, oh, we got to put EKS in there as well, right? And then, when you want to run a lot of virtual clusters and you want to run them in a very secure fashion, right? And you want to enforce certain standards across these virtual clusters, that's where our commercial product comes in.
Okay.
We call it vCluster Pro. So for example, one thing that vCluster Pro does, it packages, so to make cluster internal DNS in a vCluster work, we have a separate pod that runs core DNS deployed alongside each vCluster. And obviously that's a second thing to manage, a second container that takes up resources, right? What we do in the Pro distro is we package core DNS into the vCluster pod and build it as one container. We're also using chain guards, like secure base images for this, for example. and it just has a couple of these security and performance enhancements. One thing is also, if you have vCluster open source, you typically run the vCluster control plane and the pods that get synced down in the same namespace, right, of the real cluster. In Pro, you have the option to run what we call that feature isolated control plane. That means you can run your control planes in one cluster, but sync workloads to other clusters.
Oh, fun.
Yeah, and
that sounds really handy.
Yeah. That opens up, for example, CoreWeave is using this. Like, they build a GPU cloud. We gave a talk with them yesterday. They're very open about how they're using this internally. And what they do, obviously they sell Kubernetes and GPUs to these AI companies and folks that need GPUs, right? And for them, they obviously have SLAs on provisioning Kubernetes, on that control plane uptime, right? So security and stability and isolating that is really important for them. So they're really big, vCluster Pro user, very vocal about it. And it's those kind of scenarios where vCluster Pro really makes a ton of sense for folks.
Yeah, I like how you built that differentiated value on top of the open source code. And it sounds like folks are using the open source code independently. It's kind of that best of both worlds kind of place.
Yeah. And it's a seamless transition as well.
You mentioned in passing using ChainGuard. And so is that part of the value of the Pro product as you get this the supply chain validation?
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. We're trying to obviously make vCluster in the open source as secure as possible, right? But in Pro, there's an even additional level of scrutiny in terms of we know some companies rely on this in production at a pretty large scale. They run 300, 500, or even 1,000 vClusters, and obviously if you have any kind of CVE or things that would pop up, it's very critical for them to also have a good way of rolling it out. So one of the things that we ship in vCluster Pro 2 is a controller for vClusters and a CRD to manage these vClusters. And it's a cross-cluster controller. So you have a central place where you can create these virtual clusters and manage their life cycle with the CRD, even across clouds and across Kubernetes clusters. So
I could have one vCluster in my Amazon, and then I could manage resources off in Google or off in Azure.
Yeah, pretty much.
Multi-cloud's a special place in my heart. That's the kind of products I'm working on right now. So
Got it. Yeah, we should definitely have a chat about this, actually.
Yeah. Are you seeing customers deploying in a multi-cloud more frequently in recent times?
Yeah, a lot of the Fortune 500 companies we talk to, they have part private cloud and part public cloud. Sometimes it's one particular public cloud.
Right.
Sometimes it's even multiple. And for them, having vCluster in a way, almost like an abstraction layer on top, is a big benefit for them, right? Because they're abstracting the experience for Kubernetes, because there are subtle differences between cloud providers.
But you can kind of level that out a little bit across the clouds.
Exactly, yeah.
That's cool.
And I think for us, it allows you to do crazy things as well. I mean, you could run
I like crazy things.
For example, if you're thinking about our EKS-based vClusters, you can run them in Google Cloud now.
What? You run an EKS-style vCluster on GKE?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
Oh, that's cool. So you have flavors inside of the vCluster that maybe match the clouds?
Yeah. We have the distros, right? We support different distros under the hood, so the API server, controller manager, those are standard distro components that we take from these open source projects, right? And EKS has an open source distro that we can leverage for this, just like K0s, K3s, vanilla Kubernetes, right? And then we swap out, we don't deploy, essentially, we don't deploy the entire control plane, right? We only deploy parts of it, and then we swap out other parts to essentially make the virtual cluster, virtual, right?
Right.
But the API server, for example, comes straight up from that distro that you're using.
Really cool. So we're here at KubeCon. If you had a chance to get out and see talks or some of the other booths around here, and what's your favorite so far?
Oh, it's been an exciting conference. I'm actually a fan of the city itself.
Okay. I'm a fan of Chicago as well.
Chicago, but
yeah.
I wasn't expected. It has a lot of skyscrapers, beautiful architecture. I'm fascinated. I'm glad it's not as cold. It feels relatively
It's been a
mild.
beautiful week. Yeah.
And it's just connecting with everybody. I think KubeCon is always, it's always on the one hand side very exhausting because it's super busy. but it's also very energizing, right? It's like
Right.
ideas coming together, people chatting, just like off track and like having these, hallway discussions.
That is my favorite part of every conference is the hallway track.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's definitely a lot of fun. And this one feels like a very vibrant, very, very busy one. We've been going all in, right? Like we're a very small company. But in Amsterdam, we started becoming a gold sponsor. This time we're doing that as well. We started sponsoring the attendee T-shirts as well. So everybody's going to have a vCluster logo on their sleeve.
Nice.
And, it's just like, for us, it's about getting the word out there about vCluster. And I think, I think we're definitely, I can say after a day and a half, mission accomplished so far. Hopefully the rest of the conference will continue to be as vibrant as we've seen it on day one and the beginning of day two today.
Awesome. So I want to go back to open source a little bit. We already talked about kind of the differentiation between commercial and open source.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that we see happening kind of in the open source community is that the open core model evolving into business licenses and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
So what's vClusters, if you can, so I understand this is a thorny territory, right? But like, how do you instill that confidence in both your commercial and your open source customers that what they adopt, they're going to be able to continue to adopt?
Yeah, we don't have any plans to change the license. We are Apache 2 licensed, and I think the way we set up our product strategy, obviously, it's always easy to say that we're a very young company, so we can learn from the mistakes of the past.
Yeah.
Right, and we're kind of standing on the shoulders of giants here, right? There's like a HashiCorp or even a Docker, right? That built amazing technology and may have not thought about commercialization right from the start. We're a lot younger, and we are able to see what they did and adapt the good parts, but then adjust where we think things can be improved right from the start. So one thing we do, for example, we kind of, as you said, we have like an open core model in the sense that vCluster OSS distro is purely open source, but then we have a private repository, private fork of our own open source, right? That you can access, you can see the code of.
I want the code.
Yeah, essentially, that's a magic sauce of like isolated control plane and a couple of other things, right? And I think by setting it up that way, we essentially guarantee that this is a viable long-term model.
Right.
Because we want the core to be open source. We want people to innovate with us on the core, right? But then certain features that we think are very enterprisey, right? Features that we think, are designed for running vCluster at scale, right? We want you to engage with us on a commercial level if you are at that scale of operation, right? And I think the model of having that private fork and vCluster Pro and building these things in there and building literally just a second image, right? A second container image that you can get paid access to, I think it achieves exactly that. And then we have the nice UI and CLI and these kind of like softer benefits on top, right? But just by having that open core differentiation, that really shields us from having the relicense long term. I hope we will not have to take that step, but you never know how the future will look like. Obviously, I can't say how our company will evolve in 10 years from now, but I'm hoping setting it up in the right way to prevent these kind of steps.
Yeah, I like that dichotomy where it's kind of like as a company grows to the scale where they're deriving value from vCluster, that's the point at which they should start kind of contributing back financially to your company, which is building that value for them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, we want to make sure that everybody who runs vCluster in a non-critical way, right? You just want to get started on your laptop with your Docker desktop, or even use it as familiar environments or dev environments. So you're just like playing around with it, right? It's like non-critical, non-mission critical workloads that there is, as few of a boundary for you to get started. And, for you also to suggest features and iterate and open a pull request and open source is just a great way to do that. We have 2 other open source projects. We launched DevSpace. That was our first open source project. And we handed it over to the CNCF. It's a sandbox project now. And we really see, the value in open source. And the same with our newest project. We just launched a new one called DevPod in May this year. So it's just 6 months old. It's very, very new. And we see how vibrant and how quick we get that feedback. And I think that feedback loop is just so valuable, right?
That's kind of the core of Agile, right? Except in open source, we scale it out to the whole world. But it's that feedback loop that really makes it work. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think, we launched DevPod, and on literally day one, we had like 60,000 people get started with it.
Wow.
Tons of issues. We're now 6 months in, we have 5,000 GitHub stars, right? Tons of usage. And, I think that kind of community, people join our Slack channel. There's very, very vibrant discussions, not just between our team and users, but also amongst our users. Right?
Yeah.
And that creates very, very powerful synergies. And
it really does, yeah.
It accelerates that innovation loop that everybody wants to create for their technology.
So KubeCon isn't just Kubernetes, right? CNCF. So what, or just generally in open source, like what are some other projects that you really like?
Oh, there's a whole bunch of projects that I like. I think
like a 2 or 3.
Yeah, I think if I'd had to pick, definitely KubeCost is one of them, with their cost, open source project. I've met Webb, the founder, a few years ago at KubeCon, right? We have a bunch of common friends. They're doing some really, really interesting work there. I saw a couple of great announcements come out there. And obviously, we save a ton of Kubernetes cost, but we don't really show you how much you're saving.
Right.
But then tools like KubeCost, OpenCost.
So it's complementary to your product.
Yeah, it's very complementary. So we love when we see them in place, because then if somebody starts converting real clusters to virtual ones, they
immediately see that value in dollar signs.
See the value.
The best signal you can get in a business.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that gets me very excited. Obviously, everything that the ChainGuard folks are working on in terms of making images more secure, securing the supply chain. I think that's become a really, really hot topic. I think everybody can see that, right? I think that would be probably the two, if I have to pick, that definitely stand out in the space right now.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for talking to me today, and I hope you have a wonderful KubeCon.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Take it easy.